Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz with Anthro to UX. I'm here today with Laura Musgrave. Laura is a senior user experience researcher. She does all kinds of UX research, but also specializes in AI, data, and privacy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. She has taken many different courses, which we'll get into, but had done some studies at the University of Amsterdam in the social sciences with a focus on cyborg anthropology, a little bit there and beyond. So Laura, thanks for joining me today. Looking forward to chatting. So would you mind as I ask everybody, would you mind maybe to tell me your origin story and, let's hear how you came into anthropology and then we'll get to how you got to UX.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me as well, by the way. It's great to be talking with you. So I suppose for me, the sort of first introduction to anthropology was way back in sort of high school. We had a class that was a mixture of social sciences and history. And that's where I sort of first, came across, anthropology and certain concepts that are used a lot in anthropology. And I think that had a very sort of early influence on me in terms of my worldview and, sort of what my approach would later be in my work. And I suppose from there, my journey has been a little bit unusual, I guess. Well, maybe not that unusual, because I've heard other guests talking about how it's not necessarily sort of a straight A to B type thing. When we're sort of talking about our careers, we try and simplify it, don't we? But it's not always that straightforward. So after that, I sort of, went on to study psychology for a couple of years. In the UK, we have a qualification known as an A-level, which is around, I think it's similar to sort of AP classes or AP tests in the States. And then I felt that psychology, although it was very interesting to me, it didn't grab me in the same way that the anthropology side had before. And I was sort of much more interested in that type of ethnographic approach. And from there, I was a little bit torn between that and the other real love of my life, which was music. And I ultimately ended up going on to university I did a Bachelor of Science in Music Composition and Technology. So that was really where the technology part first sort of majorly came in for me. Off the back of that, it sort of was a little bit of a melding of the two, because I became very interested in working with other people in terms of music. So going out into local communities, working with different groups, and moved on to public engagement and community engagement roles in lots of different settings, lots of different scenarios. So there was always that kind of interest in interacting with people, that focus on connecting with people. And I was doing that for many years in one form or another. And that was really where I'd sort of developed some of those skills that I think are really useful in like qualitative fieldwork, in ethnography, where you get very used to going into a situation that is very, new to you, not knowing anyone, and having to very quickly work out, how does this work in terms of, what are the relationships here between people? And how do I build up a relationship, with people here, and understand, what's important to them. So that was sort of a really good grounding for me, I think, in terms of the UX side. I then moved into the museum field, where I was doing community engagement initially. And that very quickly sort of blurred into also incorporating user research and participatory design for museum. I worked on a museum redesign project, but also exhibition design. things like that. So that was more the non-digital user research, and was taking lots of different courses because it was really this point that I started to become aware, I guess, of anthropologists that were working in user research, and becoming very interested because I could link some of these concepts and things that they were talking about with some of those very early things that I picked up from my high school classes on social sciences. And immediately, I started to make all these connections. So I was like, oh, this is really going to be very valuable to me. So that's when I moved on to study social science research methods with the University of Amsterdam, as you mentioned. And I started taking lots of different courses, some of them, short courses in anthropology itself, some in like applied ethnography, others that sort of, related, so like commercial semiotics, things like that. And continued along the user research path, ultimately kind of realizing, okay, well, I want to now be in UX research. I want to be working on technology projects with this sort of same approach. And that's how I ended up there. And then continued to train in social theory with a particular focus on digital anthropology, doing my own field work as well, not just the, sort of projects that, perhaps I'd been asked to do by the organisation I was working for, but actually seeking to go and build my own, sort of field work and learn from that experience as well. And that's ultimately sort of how I ended up where I am today.
Good. Yeah, well, so thanks for sharing that. As you sort of joked about, right, it's not a linear A to B path as we oftentimes make it out to be. So I appreciate you sort of sharing the journey and certainly going through sort of the museum space and music and then museum, right? It is very it's very interesting to hear, right? And you can see why you learned a lot along the way, but it also, I think, helps everybody listening realize that many of us sort of take, a very strange journey into this field. And so for any of those who are doing that right now, they're not alone, which is always helpful to hear. I'd be curious to know, so between the museum space and then, like, say, as you were just describing your own ethnographic work, which was a little bit more digital, those are two interesting experiences to have sort of that like more sort of material or kind of physical background. And then, this digital piece is really interesting. And so how much of what you did at the museum, may factor into what you're doing today? Is there like, some real lessons learned there that you've brought with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this is one of the things that, is really great about user research more broadly, is that obviously you could work in a museum field, but equally you could be working in service design, which is another area that I've worked in over the years as well. And you can also work in UX research. And there's a certain amount of overlap between those areas in the sense of, a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of the research methods you use are the same. And there, a lot of the approaches that you use can also be applied. So I feel like my sort of earlier experience in the museum field, it was almost learning how to adapt the skills that I sort of had picked up from that. And certainly in the work that I did there, a lot of it was in person, which obviously, sort of when you particularly think of the last year, but perhaps even a little bit before that, we're now doing more and more remote work. And it's trying to adjust, I think, to how you engage somebody, when you're working remotely with them and that type of thing. And some of the approaches are the same, and some of them you sort of need to practice to adapt them. I think certainly in the very early stages, I had a lot of learning to do myself in terms of trying to understand, sort of lots of different things around how user research fits into an organization. And when you're sort of working with participatory design as well, how that fits into not just the organization, but the sector as well. So, for example, the museums field here in the UK, depending on the museum, will either fit into the public sector where it's funded, sort of through government funds, or it will fit into the charitable sector where it's funded by charitable activities and things like that. And that's a very different situation to working, sort of for a business or the private sector. So learning how user research and or participatory design works in one sector compared to another is also a really useful learning curve. And there's a lot of lessons that they can all take from each other and that you can take, even if you've got quite a, sort of a diverse range of experience. If you've done, different things, you can apply those in different sectors. It's more just understanding how to translate it. It was really useful for me.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I want to come back to two things. One, the remote research, but also maybe participatory design. But to just stay on like this sort of training component for a minute. So, you're essentially talking about more or less, in my words, not yours, but like building like the toolkit, the research toolkit, which then we, pull things out of when it's the right fit. And so, as you said, you took a number of courses, some short, some longer. So could you maybe elaborate on some of those and like what was particularly useful? Because a lot of people who are trying to break into the field, they are looking to augment maybe their academic experience with some other short courses. And so, there's courses, there's certificates, there's courses you could take from Epic, right? There's all kinds of stuff out there. And so maybe, would you share what you found was particularly useful and maybe has helped you in that journey to make that transition?
Yeah, so I think as I was going through the experiences myself, and as I was getting to know other people who worked in UX, I would kind of get a sense of, some sort of types of skills or knowledge that they had or were using that I felt like I could develop more myself. So I was, staying quite open, I think, to what types of courses I might do, whether it was a more academic course like the University of Amsterdam one was, or whether it was something that was perhaps more focused on, applied techniques and approaches. So I think that sort of openness to learning as much as you possibly can from lots of different sources is a good opportunity. There were sort of some courses that were more, I suppose, academic, but aimed at the general public. So, for example, UCL, based in London, the university, they have quite a well-known digital anthropology department. And they, for example, have run free courses on, sort of how people relate to social media around the world. For example, they've done global studies on how people interact with social media. Which, was one of the ones that I took. And you might not sort of initially have kind of gone, oh, okay, well, how does that fit into my day-to-day work with UX? But once I'd taken it, I sort of started seeing links to it in surprising ways in my work and things like that. So those types of courses are really good. There's obviously a lot of courses available through places like Epic, as you say, that are sort of more dedicated to applied work. Those have been incredibly useful to me as well. And I'm trying to think, I don't think I've taken too many, sort of around UX design and that type of thing, but I know that some researchers have, and they've found that useful. So I think it really depends on what type of thing you're interested in. And if you don't know what you're interested in, try lots of different things. There's so many courses that are available out there that are you can either take them free or you can take them, sort of for a low cost. So working out what you think will be most useful to you. But I found a bit of a mixture between applied and academic courses was helpful.
And how about, seeing as you're working in technology, I know you said when you studied music, you got a little bit of that tech piece there, but did you do anything else to understand the landscape of technology or business more broadly speaking, just like to, sort of upskill on things like agile or just, understand any of those kind of mindsets that we use within this space?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So I did find a short course which was all about agile approaches to sort of to UX. And I felt like that was a really good starting point to be able to understand that aspect of it, because obviously some, sort of organizations do work agilely and others don't. So it's useful to understand. I'm trying to think what other types of things. Oh yes, that was it. So as well as kind of looking to see about those types of courses, I was also looking to see what people were talking about in the sector. So what UX professionals were discussing. So places like Twitter, for example, was one of the earliest places where I almost started listening initially. I was sort of trying to pay attention to what conversations were happening in the UX space, and where people were talking about sort of agile methods. That was what triggered me to go, oh, okay, I need to maybe have a look into this and understand a little bit more of this. So it was a really good place for me to actually try and work out, okay, what types of skills and or knowledge do I have already that perhaps I just used a different name for them? And what types of skills or knowledge, could I develop more that would make me sort of a stronger candidate for a UX job, or, help me progress and advance, what I'm doing. So I feel like that's maybe another good way to start getting a sense of what's important and what's being discussed in the industry. And also it's a start into networking as well, because once you're listening into those conversations, you can then start joining in when you're feeling a little bit more confident and, have conversations with people. So, yeah, I feel, social media, and there's a lot of Slack groups available as well, that people can, sort of join and get a feel for the industry even before they join it. I'm saying the UX industry very broadly. As you said, that might be for what UX looks like in business. And certainly when I'd spent a lot more time in the public sector and the charitable sector, I'd picked up a lot of, what it was like for some people working in UX in business through those types of things, through those conversations that were happening, paying attention to conferences that were happening, like Epic, for example. People would be talking about what it was like doing ethnography in business. So even though at the time I wasn't working in business myself, I was able to pick up some of the things that people were talking about, and that perhaps challenges that they'd had that I could learn from, so that when I did move into the private sector, I had a bit of a feel for what I was moving into.
Mm-hmm. And so that all brings up something that we frequently discuss, which is networking, broadly speaking, but also like some people might refer to it as informational interviews. So, aside from like lurking on Twitter initially and maybe eventually reaching out on social media, were you doing anything to network with people in the space? Maybe the conferences is it, but like intentionally sort of trying to build a network, which you then maybe use to sort of get your first role? Or did you do anything a little bit more structured in that way?
I did, yeah, absolutely. And as I say, I sort of started with almost the observation/listening exercise, and then moved on to, perhaps responding to people specifically, more publicly. And then after a little while, I was like, okay, well, I feel like I need to get more detail here. I need to get more information. I felt like I needed to almost sort of check in with someone else and say, hey, you're where I would like to be. I'm doing these things. Am I kind of on the right lines? Because I felt like I didn't know anybody personally that I could ask at that point. And so I wanted to almost get some advice. And I, was very grateful to those folks that I reached out to speak to, because they were very, generous with their time in kind of, describing the types of things that had helped them, and, providing encouragement and those types of things. So that, I think, provided me with almost like a little push to kind of move a little bit further along. So indirectly, I would say it probably did contribute to me being able to get my first, sort of role in that, because they were helping to direct me and encourage me along the path a little bit more. So it's definitely worthwhile doing. I've been in the really nice position where, sort of people that are trying to get into UX have come to me and asked me for advice. And it's really nice to kind of be able to pay that forward, because you remember how much people helped you when you were in that scenario. And So yeah, it's definitely a worthwhile thing to do.
Great. And so, moving on kind of in the timeline and getting a little closer to what you're doing today, I'd like to maybe just touch on cyborg anthropology. So, there are, I feel like I say this all the time on these podcasts, but like in anthropology, there are various definitions of cyborg anthropology and, probably some debates about what that really means. But you're also the first person to sort of identify with overtly studying that. And so would you mind just, telling everybody from your perspective what cyborg anthropology is and maybe what interested you?
Sure. So I think for me, it's almost like part of the whole sort of digital anthropology sphere. So it was very interesting to me to start to learn about all these different theories of how we interact with technology. And as you sort of hinted at there, there's different perspectives on, how we're interacting with technology. Are we sort of merging with technology? Are we, sort of in some weird dynamic with technology? Is it a very natural thing? So there's a lot of, I guess, conversations and discussions around that. For me, I think it's very useful to learn about these types of, sort of conversations and theories, because it provides a bit of an interesting context then if you're doing work around, for example, say smartphones. There's been a lot of, focus on how people relate to smartphones and, all those sort of things where, smartphones are kind of arguably potentially like an extension of some of our functions, so providing an extension of sort of our memory or an extension of how we communicate, things like that. So there's lots of interesting stuff if anybody sort of becomes interested in digital anthropology or cyborg anthropology and wants to sort of delve into those a little bit. I've found it really fascinating to learn about. And the really nice thing is because technology is ever evolving, there's so many evolving thoughts and theories around that as well. So what was maybe really relevant 10 years ago, perhaps may or may not be relevant today. It might be, things might have moved on considerably, or whether that's the technology or whether it's sort of the thinking behind it. So, I think it's definitely an area that's particularly useful to UX for sure.
Good. And so now you're working in UX. You get to cover a range of research. Would you mind, maybe just telling us a little bit about your role and kind of, a little bit about maybe the type of research you're doing, the products you're focusing on, and then we'll dig into those a bit.
Sure, no problem. So I'm trying to think where to start. It's one of those. I'm very lucky in that my role is very varied. So from day to day, I could be working on looking at different types of devices, or I could be looking at different types of platforms, or sort of a real range of different things as well, because the brand that I work for is a global brand. It could be sort of looking at a piece of technology or an app or a website that is focused on a UK audience, or it could be something, for pretty much any international audience you can think of. So on a day-to-day basis, my work, it is really varied. I can be working on one project and the next project may come in, it'd be something completely different. And that really appeals to me because, you're never bored for a start. There's always something different that comes in. I think over time I've kind of developed my own, research interests and research specialisms, which, sort of are much more on the artificial intelligence side. So I particularly enjoy working on projects that are related to AI or emerging technologies. But there is a lot of variation in that. So, a real real range. I hope that makes some sense, but it can be so varied.
Yeah, sure. No, I think in many ways what it comes down to for people listening is like, in the consulting model, we're oftentimes project to project, right? We're kind of focused on many things. Even some, versus like maybe a product company, which is building one particular product and you're solely on that product. And of course, there's some space in the middle. Even my company, we do consulting, plus we build our own products. So we have a mix. But, if you look at it as that kind of continuum, I think it's worth thinking through for anybody who wants to get in the field because, do you want a varied experience where you get to learn something new? Of course, you're still oftentimes applying, using the same methods. You have your same toolkit that sort of, you pull something out when it's a fit. But you get to at least like learn new subject matter oftentimes or see it applied in different ways versus, if you go to a product company and you're only on one, you might become sort of an expert in that one particular product, but it's maybe a little less varied. And those roles, they both have pros and cons, but they're not for everybody, right? Or each one's not for everybody. I, like you, like the more varied approach.
Yeah.
I find it interesting to be able to work on safety equipment one day and then, in the arts the next day and learn from both of those, really. Yeah,
it keeps life interesting, and as you say, some people prefer, one particular product or one particular area that they're working on, and other people prefer a bit of a variation. But I suppose the good thing about UX is, as you just pointed out, there's those types of roles in the field, so you can get a bit of a feel for which one you think you might prefer.
Yeah. Now, also interesting, so you're saying global company, you have, UK audience, but also beyond. And so, that's one of those things that's also good to think through when considering a job or where you want to apply, right? Because obviously that changes some of the dynamics. If it's local, post-COVID at least, it will be easier to get back to sort of in-context research. And if it's global, depending on the company, you may or may not be in context all the time, and you might be doing more sort of digital ethnography or netnography. And so, even size of company also impacts the way we do research. So it's worth keeping in mind. So in your case, since you have both audiences, prior to COVID, were you doing in-context work in the UK?
Yes. Yeah. And I suppose that relates very well to, what I was saying earlier about sort of having that background in kind of public engagement, community engagement is, I've got a long, sort of history now of in-person work with people. So, that's always enjoyable. Obviously, since COVID, there's been a lot more remote research in terms of that. But I think there's a lot of ways you can kind of transfer things that you've learned in person to how you work remotely with people, because it's still about connecting with people. It's still about engaging them. It's still about building rapport with them and, all of those types of things. So, it is possible to adapt some of the things, not all of them, but it's possible to adapt a lot of the approaches. I think it's about just kind of understanding the differences between them in some ways, because, there's some things that obviously you can get from in-person research that you can't necessarily from remote, but also vice versa. There's been some things that people have shared with me through digital ethnography, through mobile ethnography, that I don't feel they would have perhaps been as frank with me had I been there in person. So there's pros and cons to each method, and I think the more that you sort of can understand both, the better positioned you are to know what's possible in terms of your resources or in terms of your time or in terms of the research question, even if you're able to sort of base your choices off that as well.
Sure. Yeah, Matt Bernius in previous episode, he said the same exact thing about how he's I think the word he used was like slip. More people are sort of slipping in the digital ethnography space because he's not there, like you said, right? So they're more kind of willing to share. I also thinking about something that Larry McGrath had said on an earlier episode, where I didn't even think to do this, but he has people sort of like almost like describe their space a bit. So rather than just virtually observing their space, which obviously we all do, where it makes sense, but he goes kind of a step further and has them, describe it a bit and to learn a little bit more about the context, which I thought was really interesting. But so today, as you mentioned, you're interested in, more emerging technologies, AI. And so maybe to start, what got you, why does that interest you?
It's a good question. Why does it interest me? I think initially it was something that was less familiar to me, as in smartphones is something that obviously has been around for some time, and we're all quite, well versed to them being in our lives. So to me, it's interesting, but it was something that perhaps I'd, had a lot of time to digest, both as on a personal basis and as a researcher. And some of the more sort of emerging technologies and sort of newer technologies, they raise different questions, I think. So, for example, one of my my own independent research projects has been around smart speakers and privacy and convenience. And for me, the fact that you had this permanent piece of technology in your home, and it wasn't just, having an impact on the person that brought it in, but it was also being interacted with by other members of the family or whoever else was living in that space. And, their data was also kind of a part of this whole picture as well. So that to me was really interesting, because before, when I was working with smartphones, I was thinking, well, okay, maybe some people share a smartphone, but a lot of the time, sort of the participants that I've worked with, it's been maybe them and sort of one or two other people. It's not sort of being used on a very, very, very regular basis by lots of different people. It's kind of maybe a very small number of people. Whereas when I first, sort of started thinking about smart speakers and, other types of smart home technology, I immediately was like, okay, this raises some interesting questions that I'm really curious about. So I think perhaps for me, it's the curiosity of it, the novelty, the newness of it, wanting to understand, sort of how they're impacting each other, how are people interacting with that technology, but also, is it having an impact on the people there? So some of the participants in my study had kind of found ways to adapt how they were living, because this smart speaker was in the home. So they would sort of go and have conversations in different rooms because they were worried it would overhear them or whatever. So, which is, fair enough, that was their, sort of concern. So I suppose that's the thing that fascinates me is what impact is that having? What benefits do people get from that technology, and what things, maybe have not been considered so much? What maybe are the risks or the concerns? Yeah, curiosity, I would say, is the answer.
I hear you. And actually, it's interesting because we're doing something very similar. So, that was your personal research, and so I've been doing work in the genetic space, and that does grow out of client work and a thesis, but I've continued to do it beyond those relationships. And so I want to dig into that for a second, because I think it's an interesting way, like in your case, like to have a portfolio piece to, I know you spoke on it at the Responsible Tech Conference, but the previous name of that, was it Anthropology Technology, I think, right?
That's right.
And so, having these personal sort of projects is good for a portfolio, but it may also raise the question of like, you don't have like a, you don't have an affiliation. Is there any ethical concerns there, right? There's some of that we can dig into. But I also just want to point out that it's very interesting because you're doing it with the smart speaker. I was doing it genetics, but both implicate the other people around you, right? Because if I take a genetic test, it essentially implicates all of my family, especially if I then make that data public, which a lot of people do. on on websites that are more or less you could almost describe as sort of like open sourcing your genome. But so there's a very similar aspect to what we're doing, and then building on that, there's the sort of the data and ultimately the data and privacy piece, right? And so that's really interesting. And maybe maybe offline we can talk about that more, and maybe there's an opportunity there. But in terms of you doing sort of your own research, so I appreciate being in a similar position that it gives you an ability to develop skills, to develop a portfolio piece. And I think it's worth anybody doing if they have an interest in a topic, right? But to my earlier point, we need to go about it the right way. Of course, we still need to protect privacy. And so did you do anything particular in that space to sort of, ensure, I mean, you don't have an IRB, right? But to sort of ensure that people are being protected in a similar way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, at the time I was, sort of going through a process of professional development in terms of reviewing how I approach things, trying sort of new methods. So getting more familiar with like mobile ethnography, for example, which was what I had used as my main method for the study. And actually, going through that process of making sure that I had all of the relevant things in place to be able to do everything, to a university standard, effectively. So I've got contacts as well that work in academic research, who I was able to sort of, bounce ideas off and sort of say, look, this is the process that I'm using, and for my professional development, I sort of want to have some conversations with you around, is there anything else that I need to consider, and getting a sense of, for my own development, how are my processes? Is there something that I need to review or improve on? As you say, from the sort of, business side, we have to be very familiar with data protection and, sort of how we process participant data as well. So I'd had to go through a lot of thinking around, how am I going to store the participant data? How am I going to, sort of manage that? How am I going to deal with all this sort of, consent? Because that's an important part of it as well, is obviously being able to communicate to the participant what I am aiming to do with the data that I'm collecting from that study, and, sort of what the outcomes will be, because they have to obviously know that to consent to being part of the study as well. So yes, it was a really useful one for me because I had to almost look at my own processes with fresh eyes and sort of make sure that I was doing all of the appropriate things, check in with other people to sort of say, okay, this is the process that I'm planning. Can you give me some feedback? Is there anything you'd change or do differently? And it was a really useful thing, for me to do, and made it a bit more of a portfolio piece, as you mentioned, because I'd sort of it's good evidence of my professional development. So it was hard work, but I definitely, like you, I would recommend it to anyone that's thinking of doing something similar. It's been very worthwhile, both in terms of my development, but also as a portfolio piece, as evidence of the work that I've done.
And did it, I'm not sure the exact timeline here. So did it help contribute to you getting any of your UX jobs, like in the technology space, or, whether that's, the first one or now, your current one, did it play a role in any of that or open any doors by, giving the talk that you gave, or?
I'm trying to remember I think this was later on in the timeline, but I had done something similar earlier on in my career. This sounds a little bit interesting in terms of the timeline, but way before that, probably around the time of my museum job, initially I had obviously had this history of working in public engagement, community engagement, and so I needed to, I guess, get some experience in terms of using user research methods and everything else. So I had almost sort of looked for opportunities to do that within the job that I had at the time. And they were sort of like smaller studies, I guess you could say, where I could sort of show the organization that I was working for, okay, here's the type of thing we could do, and here are the sort of benefits of that. And for myself, then I was actually able to almost, sort of build that into my job role and get that experience. So that wasn't necessarily a personal project because I was doing it on behalf of the organization, but I almost had to, sort of set up the project and think it through and sort of show it to them and say, okay, how would it be if we did this? And I could use that then as evidence to not only that organization to say, okay, well, now we've done that, we can do more of these for different things, but also I could use that as a portfolio piece in its own right, because I could say, well, here's something that I planned and set up. And I didn't have the word UX in my title, I didn't have the word researcher in my title, but I was doing user research. And it was almost kind of looking for that opportunity from where I was at that time, the role that I was in. And I think Laurel, who was on a previous podcast, she talked about having a similar experience. So, I feel like I did a version of that earlier on in my career, which did help me progress.
Yeah, the thing that strikes me there is, they sort of demonstrate entrepreneurship or like intrapreneurship, if you will, right? And just demonstrate to others the ability to sort of plan, to start to follow through, right, to manage your own project, which is useful for anybody to see in business, that you as a potential employee can do that. And of course, even our academic projects, like if we have an applied project, that can demonstrate those similar qualities, but doing these sort of extracurricular ones can also be very beneficial. And it's also a good way, it even touches, like your example there touches on an article I wrote many years ago for UserZoom about kind of like how to almost start like a UX practice to a degree. And, so for anybody who's like maybe in a role where they want to do this work, but they don't quite have the opportunity, if you can sort of just find your own project within the organization and demonstrate the value, it oftentimes can blossom into something else. Which
Absolutely.
Which is a good way to ultimately find the role that you want, and that could even be in an academic department, like do something for the school if you're still, in that space, right? Like, improve the registration process, whatever it may be, there's projects
Absolutely.
to be found. Yeah, right.
That's it. Yeah. Regardless of, wherever you might be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a digital project, as you mentioned. It may be, sort of something that is more around a service or around a physical space. You're still using user research methods that can be translated into a UX career, and it's still evidence for your portfolio. So, yeah, definitely have a look at what potential opportunities there may be, because you might be surprised by the opportunities that are there.
Yeah, there's always room for improvement somewhere.
For sure.
So to touch maybe on the AI piece. So obviously, like smart speakers, there's an AI component in that machine learning is playing a role in recommendations, but the applications are far and wide. So can you talk a little bit about, your interest, particularly in AI, and maybe we can get into some of the data and privacy concerns that exist there?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that all sort of came about for me off the back of the smart speakers project that I'd done. And then I started sort of, wanting to kind of understand more. I'd done a lot of reading prior to that around sort of the current discussions that were taking place in the AI sort of industry, and getting up to speed on sort of the literature that was there. But it was sort of after I'd done the smart speakers project, I was immediately like, okay, well, what else is there? What kind of other real world, sort of things are happening here in terms of the impact on people and the impact of people on AI? How are these things developing from here? Because once I'd sort of learned a little bit about it, it was almost a sense of, well, this is still developing, and there's a very real opportunity here for people with anthropology, training to really have a positive impact in that industry, in that area. So, it was of real interest to me because not only was it sort of a relatively new, sort of field, but the fact that it is growing so fast at the moment, it's, AI is touching every corner of our lives, whether we are consciously aware of that or not. It's making, sort of recommendations in terms of, music recommendations, perhaps if you use a streaming system, or it may be recommending what you watch if you're on Netflix, or if you are using social media, it may be deciding what things you see or don't see in terms of updates from friends or job adverts, things like that. So whether we're consciously aware of it, it is touching already lots of different aspects of our lives. And that was one of the things that to me made it feel very urgent, that it needed people with social science backgrounds involved. And the conference that you mentioned earlier, the Responsibility Tech Summit that is coming up in May, that is sort of one of those key areas that's trying to bring those conversations together of, the conversations from the tech industry and from computer science and the social science aspect, bringing anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists into the mix and having everybody talk about it together and go, okay, well, what can we do to improve the situation and make sure that we are maximizing the benefits of AI and other emerging tech? I'm saying AI because that's my main interest. And how can we minimize the risks to people for this?
And so in the AI space, is there any particular area that you're most interested in, like such as the relationship to data and privacy or algorithmic bias, or, is there any one area that you want to focus on?
It's really tough because there's so many interesting areas. So it's really, really hard to sort of pin it down a lot of the time. But I am, I am especially interested in the data and, privacy side of it, because that was a core part of my smart speakers study, and it's become part of a lot of conversations that I've been in, and that is one of the key areas that I think is one of sort of the most urgent conversations we need to have. And obviously in recent years there's been a very big shift in the tech industry, and I suppose the public view of the tech industry as well, in terms of asking a lot more questions about data and privacy and what's happening to it. So I feel like naturally I'm most drawn to that part, but there are so many different aspects. As you mentioned, like algorithmic bias is really interesting, and something that needs, again, urgently addressing in a lot of different applications of AI. And I'm trying to think of all the different other aspects of it, accountability. So who's responsible for the decisions that some of these algorithms are making? If it's a financial algorithm that's deciding, excuse me, if somebody gets credit or not, who is responsible for that? Those types of things. So there is a lot of different interesting aspects, but I think probably, data and privacy is the main one that I'm drawn to.
Got it. Just building on the accountability comment, I'm not studying this, but I have an interest in following what's happening in the music space with AI, which I imagine you might be interested in as well, given your background. But there's definitely a conversation to be had about derivative works, right? So if AI tools, if machine learning based music creation tools are being trained on existing data, say like, existing melodies, and then they're now being used to generate melodies on the fly, is that a derivative work or not, right? It's a very gray area. And, melodies might be relatively, a single melody might seem relatively simplistic, but of course there's also AI that's now writing full songs more or less, right? And they're not wonderful yet, but I can envision a world where they get good enough to write pop songs based on, the current taste, right? And that then sort of, if it's based on the current taste of the training data, that's ultimately tied to the training data of what's popular right now. What does that also imply about like the future state of music, right? Is it just sort of like a reflection of what was already popular and sort of amplifying that in a way that, removes like all of the beauty of the variety of music? And so there's a lot of interesting things happening in there. which maybe again is for another time for us, given our music interests. But on the data and privacy piece, so, you said it's, an urgent issue that needs to be addressed. And I agree. Now, in a recent Society for Applied Anthropology panel that I had hosted, there were varying views on data. And some thought, Yulia Grunberg thought that it's, that in her work, she sees that a lot of data sets are kind of messy. And I think there's an argument to be made there that, there is, but I could, maybe see that in terms of when you're like sort of aggregators of data, that you're pulling together data from different data sets. I could certainly see how that's very messy. But I know from working in tech, when you look at like analytics platforms, the data they collect directly from a mobile device is not messy at all, right? It's very clear cut that this is this user, this is their device, they've used it these times in these locations. It is very, very clean and very, very telling about a user. And so, I think there's the argument of messiness or not, there's likely sides in which it is and it's not messy, right? And I'm particularly maybe interested in more of the area where it's very clear cut and it's like genetics, right? That is like big data to its core. It's literally like everything about you. If you get a whole genome scan, that is you in terms of a genetic profile, and it's massive amount of data, and there's a lot that it has a lot of implications, and so does a lot of the data that's being collected, via say mobile devices, or even cross device. And so I agree with you, it's an urgent issue. But what is your main concern there? Is it the fact that the data is being collected? Is it the fact that the owner doesn't really have, at least today, doesn't have many options of whether they give that up or not, or the fact that they don't get monetized, that they're not being compensated for it? Is there any like particular area that you're focused on?
I think there's probably, as you say, there's a lot of different issues swirling in that, kind of pool, isn't there, at the moment? I think the thing for me is probably, there's a couple of things. One being, how much people understand about, what is happening with their data and what it's being used for, how much data is being collected, what type of data is being collected, because a lot of the participants that I've worked with, generally speaking, tend to think of it as being sort of very vague data. It's very vague information that's difficult to sort of tie back to them. And as you've said, there are some scarily precise, sort of bits of data being collected about people, from a tech perspective. And I think it's almost that awareness of what happens, with that data. Is it being all sort of compiled together? If it is being compiled together and brought together in like sort of a profile, how is it being used? So we were talking about sort of algorithmic bias as well. That kind of also plays a part in the sense of, there was some work that had been done previously by Sandra Wachter and her colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, where they'd sort of found that certain jobs were being advertised to sort of more to people with profiles that had selected male in their social media profiles, more than people that had other gender identities and that type of thing. So I think you wouldn't know necessarily, you wouldn't be aware that you had not been shown those pieces of information. So I think there's a lot of different aspects to it. It's what's happening with the data, what's being collected, but then what happens to it once it's being collected, sort of how is it being sort of used, and what impact is that having on you? Is there something that is not being shown to you, or you're not being sort of informed about what's happening, and is it affecting your experience of something? So there's so many different aspects, but I think, it's almost that flow of data and where it goes, and the knowledge of the person who is ultimately the source of that data that is the thing that's most in my mind a lot of the time.
Yeah, I just building on the example you gave, I'm reading right now a whole bunch of papers on algorithmic bias for a project I'm working on, and To be frank, I don't remember any author names right now because I'm just going through so many at once. But I was reading in a paper the other day a very similar example, and maybe it's in fact the same example, in which job who was considered an ideal candidate was ultimately tied to gender because the training data was historically biased because it related to sort of gender disparities within STEM fields. And so, because of STEM fields being historically dominated, by males today, like, the recommendations are for those fields are being slanted towards males, at least in this example. And maybe it was a hypothetical example. I don't recall at the moment, but anyway, even if it wasn't a hypothetical example, or even if it was, you can see how, that could really play out in real world, such as with police systems and sort of over policing now, and historically sort of like, areas that were policed because of racist policies. So yeah, I'm with you. And also, to what you're saying, again, in my genetics work, I'm interested in particularly kind of like the informed consent process, if you will, right? I know, which sounds like very academic, but ultimately the contracts, the terms of service that we opt into when using these systems, because quite frankly, we know that the vast majority of people do not read those at all, right? And dark patterns are oftentimes used to make it frictionless to opt into these, and so then you're oftentimes granting data, like say in the genetic case, oftentimes your continued use of these systems. There's language in the contract in which your continued use of their systems gives them the ability to more or less sort of change the contract at will and use the data in ways unintended at the time of like maybe when you signed up. And so, that's a scary position to be in. And so to your point, the knowledge that people have when choosing to opt in, and then how is that data, collected and processed after is it's a very interesting space, and one that we can contribute to. And so I guess moving forward, this is a really ripe area for us to be involved in. Others, we need to encourage others to get involved in that. Of course, the work you're doing is important, but we need more of you, right? So if you were going to recommend to anybody of maybe like how they could kind of get into similar work, is there anything that, we haven't touched on that maybe you would suggest?
It's a good question. I think always the starting point, whether it's UX and or AI, it would be sort of trying to make contact with the communities and the conversations that are happening, which we sort of touched on earlier from the UX side. I think, again, because AI is such a relatively new sounds wrong, but it's a growing field. I should probably say it's not new. It's been around for a while, but there's a renewed interest in it at the moment, and it's a growing field. So there are a lot of courses, again, that are available, a lot of them for free, that are being made available from some universities, and some companies are actually making some available, where you can understand the technical aspects of it, or, in some cases they're actually doing more of the sort of corporate responsibility and the ethical side of it, which is probably more the area that I'm most interested in, and the sort of social implications of it, the sort of that type of aspect of AI. So there's definitely a lot of those types of things that people can tap into, and again, a lot of conversations that are happening. Even if you can't get a sort of a conference ticket for sort of certain conferences that are happening in this space, even being able to find out what the hashtags are for those conversations, because certainly when I was first getting started, I was like, oh, okay, I'm not sure I can afford to go to that conference, but I'd love to, but I do want to hear what's being said. So sometimes, if you can find out the hashtag for that conference, you can actually then look on Twitter or LinkedIn and find out what people are saying about it. People are generally pretty good, I've found, on Twitter, live tweeting certain things. There's always like a few people that are really active. So even if you don't know what the hashtag is, try searching for some keywords. And once you know that there's a conference happening that's relevant to these types of things, if you're not able to be there yourself, look up the hashtags and follow the conversations that way. And then at least you're learning, and you're able to get some information there initially. Slack groups may also be another way that you can sometimes people will share videos or papers after the fact that you can kind of go and look up.
Good. One thing also that I wanted to come back to, but could be, I think, valuable for people who want to maybe get into this work is the concept of like participatory design. Because particularly, like, say, if anybody who's interested in being a researcher within the AI space, I mean, this applies more broadly for sure, but certainly within the AI space, you are absolutely going to be part of a cohort, of a cross-disciplinary team working together. And that really is frequently the case in business anyway, but it's, this is a field where, it's a very abstract field. We absolutely need to be partnering with engineering and data science. And so, learning how to work together to co-create something is really important. And so you did touch on that earlier. And is that anything that you particularly did training in, or just sort of self-study?
I think I would say I spent quite a lot of time trying to understand what, those different roles do, and whether that was through sort of my, online networking and sort of, as I say, sort of observing and listening to the conversations that were happening, but also actively trying to read up on, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, almost like an overview of, well, what does a, product manager do, or what does, a data scientist do in, sort of a business role, trying to get a bit of a sense of what their priorities might be, before I kind of got to that point where I was in that role already. And at that point, then you can start to, turn your sort of engagement skills and communication skills to actually sort of working with that individual and understanding what's important to them. But before you get to that point, you can absolutely find out more by proactively looking things up and trying to understand, what happens in those roles. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier, which I think might be very relevant, is a lot of people that I speak to that are kind of wanting to get into UX or AI don't always necessarily think about their skills and their knowledge that they have already as transferable to those things. They might say, well, I've done all this, sort of groundwork, or, I've done all this training, and, I can do X, Y, and Z, but they're not relevant to UX. And I'd be like, well, you'd be really surprised how transferable they are. So, if you did sort of field work and you had to learn another language, then actually, if you go and work for an organization that is working with people that speak that language, or may do in the future, so like a global brand as an example, then that's very applicable, and that absolutely is a skill you can use in your UX research. For me, I had the audio background, so I was very used to editing audio clips, which meant that it was very easy for me to learn how to edit videos, which are very applicable in the UX role, because sometimes you need audio and video clips to be able to get that story across and let participants, tell the story in their own words. So there's a lot of different skills that, those of you listening probably have already that you haven't thought of as a UX skill, and absolutely are and can be applied. It may just be a case of knowing a bit more about the language of the UX industry, so you can translate those skills for a company when you are, trying to apply for those roles. You can use the terms that they would use to describe those types of skills. But I think absolutely there's a lot to be said for transferable skills that you probably have already, and you may not necessarily realize can be great for UX. So the more that you learn about the UX industry, the more you can kind of frame what you have already, in the UX light, and the more that you'll start to realize, oh, okay, well, actually, this is an area that I could develop more, and that's where I'm going to go and look up some more information, or look up a course, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, fantastic point. So definitely agree. Maybe we'll end it there. So just to wrap up, anything that you want to mention, any upcoming speaking engagements, or anything that you're just passionate about that you want to plug?
Sure thing. So I'm chairing a session in data privacy and responsibility at the Responsibility Summit that we've spoken about. That's in May. So definitely check that out. There's a link to it on my website, with my research website, which is Laura Musgrave, musgrave.co.uk, and you'll find a link to it on the homepage there. And feel free to get in touch with me. I'm most active, I think, on Twitter. I'm at L Musgrave there. And there's various links on my website that you can sort of follow to connect with me. So please feel free. And thank you very much for having me, Matt.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. And I would just add that you also are a musician with, actively releasing music. So I would also encourage everybody to check out your music. And where could they maybe find that?
So that is on my music website, which is Laura Musgrave Music, all one word, .co.uk. And you can check my music side out there.
Great. Wonderful. It's where you got your interest in tech, so it's all relevant.
Absolutely.
Very cool. So, Laura, thanks. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.